Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on a catalog and survey of critical materials research collaboration between industry and the national laboratories. A summary of a report completed by Battelle on behalf of USEA through our consensus program. For those of you who are not familiar or as familiar with USEA, the United States Energy Association is a nonprofit educational association that represents the full gamut of the energy industry. So from fossil fuels to renewables to nuclear and everything in between. It is an apolitical organization, very much all of the above and agnostic towards energy types. USEA has programs pretty much all over the world on just about every continent except for Antarctica and Australia. USEA engages in capacity building, education of stakeholders, and really seeks to help the world in general become more sustainable, as well as build out energy access to those in energy poverty. USEA has programs with the U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. Department of State, and as you see here with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. Our work with FECM is mostly under what we call the consensus program. And for those of you who are not familiar with the consensus program, it seeks to educate the public, policymakers, industry, and other stakeholders, and builds a consensus on the benefits of and requirements for various carbon management technologies, such as CCUS, as you can see here, carbon dioxide removal, methane emissions mitigation, and sustainable domestic development of rare earths and critical minerals, as we will be discussing today. We do this through a series of activities, including briefings and webinars, such as today's, workshops that we actually have a series of workshops coming up here on a variety of topics, reports that we put out throughout the year, as well as the monthly news clips to help keep our stakeholders informed. If you are not already subscribed to our mailing list, please feel free to email my colleague, Michelle Littlefield at mlittlefield@usea.org. Just a quick logistical note for today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded. The presentation and recording will be posted to the event page at usea.org/events. Attendees are muted. However, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and we will attempt to address as many as possible at the end. Now, introducing our speaker today is Dr. Morgan Evans, who's a principal research scientist at the Energy and Resilience Division at Battelle. Dr. Evans, I misplaced my notes here. Dr. Evans received her bachelor's in chemistry and PhD in environmental science from The Ohio State University. So my apologies to any Michigan fans out there. Dr. Evans' interdisciplinary background includes environmental engineering, microbiology, analytical chemistry, and bioinformatics in oil and gas and mining systems. Her current projects involve developing and improving chemical and biotechnologies for recovery of critical minerals from electronic waste, mine waste, and coal ash to enable sustainable and economically viable domestic supply chains for critical minerals. So with that, it's my pleasure to pass the mic over and let Dr. Evans take it away. The floor is yours, Morgan.
Thanks so much, Alex. Let me just share my screen. All right, as long as there are no technical issues there, we'll go ahead and get started. So as Alex mentioned, my name is Dr. Morgan Evans. I'm very pleased to be speaking to everyone today. We put together this catalog and survey of critical materials research collaboration between industry and national laboratories, and I'll dive in a minute into what kind of went into that report. But before I do that, I wanted to explicitly state that the views and opinions presented in this PowerPoint don't necessarily state or reflect those of the United States government or any government agency. Before I dive into the report itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about who Battelle is, mostly because many folks are familiar with Battelle for managing several of the national laboratories. And that's a very important piece of Battelle that we're proud to be a part of. But I actually sit in the contract research group, which is separate from the laboratory operations group. And the reason I wanted to mention that, and I think that's relevant, is because we're going to be talking about the national laboratories today. And so I wanted to make it clear this is not coming from the national laboratory management side of Battelle. This is coming from the contract research side of Battelle. And Battelle is a nonprofit charitable trust formed by the will of Gordon Battelle almost 100 years ago. Our main mission is to translate scientific discovery and technology advances into societal benefits. And we're the world's largest nonprofit, independent nonprofit R&D organization. And a big focus besides the contract research and the laboratory operations is our STEM education and philanthropy group. But moving on to the report, that's the subject of this webinar. The objective that we had was to identify potential barriers of collaboration between stakeholders in critical materials research, and then to provide some mitigation recommendations. And I'll back up a little bit and mention that the catalyst for really writing this report came from a USEA workshop last fiscal year that was done where several DOE national laboratory researchers were interviewed and surveyed. And one of the issues that was identified was visibility of the national labs research in the critical materials space, and the collaboration with industry and wanting to have some strengthened partnerships in that department. So we divided our report into three main thrusts. The first is a summary of the types of critical materials research being done by the national laboratories. And one of our main objectives with this thrust was to really help increase that visibility that was being identified as problematic before. We included some information about the Critical Materials Institute that pulls together researchers from 4 of the national labs, as well as many academic and industry partners. The second thrust of this report is looking at very generally at some of the federal funding toward critical materials research. So we know many folks are interested in how the government is funding some of this work. And so looking at several of the last years and what type of work is being funded. And then the third thrust that we have in this report is looking at a survey that we administered to national laboratory members, as well as several members of industry in the critical materials space. And we designed the survey to assess the efficacy of the collaboration between these two entities in the critical materials space. So moving into our first thrust, looking at the research going on in the national labs with respect to critical materials. We put together a catalog of scientists, engineers, and project managers working in this space at the national labs. We've included contact information from those who are consenting to have their information published, as well as research interests of those scientists, so that people reading this report will be able to identify national lab researchers that they can partner or collaborate with. We also pulled a list of patents from the past 5 years coming from national laboratories in the critical materials space. And I wanted to mention on the subject of the national labs and being able to partner with them, that the national labs are affiliated with user facilities that the DOE's Office of Science runs. There are 28 of these user facilities, and they span research interests from advanced computing to basic energy sciences to biological and environmental type work, all the way to nuclear physics. And many of these user facilities have agreements that can be entered into by members of industry or universities to be able to actually perform research and do analytical testing and that sort of thing at these user facilities. And so I've included a link here at the bottom, but we'll also discuss that in the report. Just wanted to mention that. I wanted to spend a little bit of time diving into the Critical Materials Institute itself. I will mention that many national labs that are not members of the Critical Materials Institute or affiliate members are doing critical materials research. And so that is encompassed in the report. But to dive into the CMI specifically, CMI is a DOE Energy Innovation Hub housed at Ames National Laboratory. It was launched in 2013, and the objective was to seek innovations in critical materials research and for domestic supply chain security. And so as of fiscal year 2021, in the recent report that the CMI published, there are 4 national laboratory members, which is Ames National Laboratory, Idaho National Laboratory, Lawrence Livermore, and Oak Ridge National Lab. And then NETL, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, is an affiliate member. There are currently 30 industry members and 15 university members. And then there's a second category of membership, affiliate membership. And there are just as many affiliate members in the industry and university categories. Over the past 8 years, CMI has reported 156 invention disclosure reports, and they have filed for 57 patent applications. So they've been highly productive from a technology development perspective. And part of our report is really a catalog of the research and currently funded projects under the CMI. We've also included some technology transfer award information. So in the top right part of the screen, you can see National Lab Industry Collaboration projects from fiscal year 20. And so Ames National Lab, Oak Ridge, Lawrence Livermore were able to partner with different corporations to license or further develop some of their technologies and bring them to the field. And then there were 2 companies that were able to use Ames and INL's technology as part of STTR awards in some of their work. So very exciting kind of technology transfer information there. And the 4 kind of main pillars of CMI, their research initiatives, are diversifying supply. So this includes expanding sources, looking at transformative processes and new uses for co-products. The second being driving reuse and recycling. So how can we use available materials more efficiently? How can we reduce waste in manufacturing and increase recycling? How do we develop substitutes that can meet the needs that the critical materials currently meet, but use less of those critical materials? And so an example of this would be magnets with reduced rare earth content. And then finally, cross-cutting research. So developing new research tools and forecasting what materials might become critical in the future. So really a proactive thrust. And sustainability and supply chain analyses are main components of this research initiative. So moving on to the second thrust of this report, looking at some of the government engagement side of things. The critical materials space is really funded and kind of dealt with in a very bipartisan manner. Support goes back through multiple different White House administrations. And as of recently, government agency support is requiring more of a holistic approach than what we've seen in the past. And so we're seeing funding opportunities and projects being run out of several offices of the DOE, the DOD, and we're seeing interest from EPA and NSF as well in funding critical materials work. So the Department of Energy, the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, has largely funded a lot of carbon ore-based feedstock research. And the EERE office has funded a lot of kind of e-waste and critical material alternatives. There are also investments from the DOE's Office of Science, from nuclear energy. ARPA-E has funded several critical materials projects. The Mineral Sustainability Office and Fuel Cycle R&D as well. And so there's been large-scale investment by the DOE in this area. The Department of Defense, there's been large investments in conventional mining for rare earths and critical materials through various offices under the Office of Industrial Policy. And then the EPA hasn't had a lot of funding in recent years geared towards critical materials specifically, but there is interest in how EPA can utilize different waste streams to help from a waste perspective, as well as potentially producing critical materials as byproducts of remediation. And finally, there is significant congressional support in this space. The bipartisan infrastructure bill has large investments into things like demonstration facilities for rare earths, mapping of critical minerals by the USGS, and then things like kind of substitutes and replacements, recycling, that sort of thing. And so moving into the last piece of our report, the third thrust, looking at the survey that we designed, we asked the national laboratories and relevant industry stakeholders their perspectives on the collaborative environment for critical materials research. And the questions that we asked are listed in our report, and I'll read through them here as well. The first is, what is your current impression of the collaboration process with whatever entity you're not a part of in the critical materials space? Have you collaborated with a national lab or industry member before on critical materials research? What was that process like? Were there desirable outcomes for your organization? Third, are you aware of funding mechanisms for collaborative efforts between these two groups? And is the process of securing funding straightforward? Fourth, can you think of ways that collaboration can be improved? And fifth, what do you believe are important next steps in commercialization of critical material technologies? So the response, will first cover what the industry stakeholders had to say. And we surveyed several industry members ranging from very small business to larger scale businesses. The main themes that materialized from this survey were that, number one, there are often friendly relationships between industry and national lab members in the critical materials space, but they don't often seem to materialize into organized research projects. Some of the reasons that were mentioned that may be part of this is that the interests of these two groups are not always aligned. And there was some information to suggest that national laboratory research focuses can be shaped by identification of buyers or users of downstream technologies and solving issues related to supply chain issues. And one piece of feedback coming from industry is, having kind of problems that require a quick solution and needing a place where they can bring that type of problem. A second kind of theme that popped up in the survey was that it's difficult to identify the right partners without prior knowledge or working relationships. So some of that visibility piece that we talked about at the beginning. Third, that funding mechanisms seem limited in their ability to incentivize or facilitate collaboration. Several of the small businesses we talked to said that they feel very open to collaborating with national labs, but that the funding mechanisms that they were eligible for or really had a chance at winning were limited to SBIR and STTR calls. Cost share was mentioned as a challenge, especially for some of the smaller businesses, and industry stakeholders are not always aware of current funding opportunities. Finally, there was mention that existing national laboratory commercialization strategies could be improved to better benefit industry. Moving forward to look at the response from the national laboratory stakeholders, the issues that stakeholders in the industry face and potential researchable solutions are unclear to the national laboratories. So national laboratory researchers are more than happy to try to help solve industry's problems, but they don't know what those problems are. Secondly, industry doesn't generally appear interested in the national lab technologies due to the earlier technology readiness levels, despite the fact that maybe some of the analytical techniques or R&D advances could be of interest to industry. There was mention that getting members of industry to collaborate with one another on large scale projects can be very challenging. There was recognition that, interestingly enough, collaboration between national labs and industry in the battery field appears to be a lot more mature than for other critical materials. So the LI Bridge, MERF, and the EcoCar EV Challenge are all kind of DOE, national lab, industry partnership kind of consortiums or challenges that have been very successful and worked very well together, but that the same type of collaborative workspace and some of these collaborative events are not as ubiquitous in the critical materials space when we look at something like rare earths or some of these other kind of technologies that are not battery related necessarily. And so there was mention that maybe we can dive into and look at some of those success stories and see what we can learn from them. As mentioned previously in this presentation, there are user facilities where at national labs where industry can do proprietary research. There are agreements where industry can have their trade secrets protected, but also get some of the analytical and benchmarking work that might be done on some of their projects. And then finally, it was mentioned that the Critical Materials Institute does have partner and teaming opportunities at various levels. So as I mentioned, there are member levels, affiliate members, and then sponsored research partner levels. And there's also the technology commercialization process where industry can license the IP from the national labs. And it was mentioned that the CMI itself does not issue RFPs, but statements of work can be developed for organizations to work with the CMI. And this actually allows flexibility for entities to work with the CMI on new issues that might arise. So after the issuing of the survey, we also collected some kind of recommendations as part of those questions. And so some of the responses that we received mirrored the following. First, project managers who have experience with commercialization should ideally be involved or even managing the finances of collaborative research, in large part, I think, to free up the scientists to do what they do best, to do the research. Second, having some kind of targeted outreach program would be helpful for increasing visibility and partnership between these two entities. Looking at some of these success stories and documented cooperation with industry partners, that should be looked at with the same weight as published scientific papers. That was a kind of a consensus that partnership with industry should be highly valued as a success story, whether it be in the kind of academic world or where have you, that should be held to a high standard and given a lot of credibility. Requests for information, continuing to issue those and have them be open to all of these different entities and specifically seek out some of these entities. There was mention that proposal preparation being shortened and more streamlined to be quicker with more kind of short 6 to 12 month projects that are maybe smaller funding with more focused goals, that could be a very helpful kind of way to move forward. Looking at some different mechanisms for linking R&D and commercialization. So maybe looking specifically at funding opportunity announcements to further technology readiness levels for specific technologies, and maybe specific mechanisms within FOAs to connect fundamental research with industry and to incentivize some of those collaborations on projects. It was brought up that more open sharing of technology development through key performance indicators could be really helpful without revealing any trade secrets. So having some kind of benchmarking process or association that can look at some of these key performance indicators, and both industry and national lab researchers can actually know objectively how their technology stacks up against the state of the art or upcoming technologies. There was mention that we could learn about collaborative effort success between national labs, industry, and academics in other research areas. So we mentioned kind of the battery space, but even the pharmaceutical world or oil and gas, where some of these entities have worked together for much longer periods of time. What can we learn from kind of those entities in those spaces? And then finally, looking at how DOE can facilitate kind of create a protected consortia for open discussions on technology, which the CMI does have protections for industry members who join, but this was mentioned as an additional kind of point that could be helpful. And so at this point, that concludes the presentation of the catalog and survey of the National Laboratory and industry collaboration efforts. I've listed my email address here. If there are specific questions that would be better to answer via email. But I believe that Alex will take the floor at this point.
Great, thank you so much, Morgan. Have a couple of questions that came in. And for those who are a bit newer to the industry, can you kind of clarify what TCF, SBIR, and STTR are?
Yeah, so the SBIR, STTR are kind of a type of funding opportunity that's specific to smaller businesses. And so the awards, I believe, I'm not terribly familiar with this myself, as Battelle is not a small business. So we've never applied for one of these before, but my understanding is that they're geared towards funding smaller businesses and have different phases that they can kind of move from phase one, kind of more proof of concept, through phase two, and do further testing and development or scale up of some of the technologies. And they can come through several different government agencies like NSF or DOE.
Got it. And then what about the other two, the TCF and the STTR? Are those also geared towards small businesses, or?
I know that the STTR is, but the TCF I'm actually not super familiar with.
Okay, got it. And then I know you had kind of mentioned at the beginning just a few of the national laboratories, and there was a comment here just that PNNL does work in the area of mineral extraction funded via AMO and 2 TCF projects. And I believe that information is included in the report. Do you mind just going through the list of the national labs that have been included in the report, just to make sure, you know, we don't, you know, make sure everyone understands that we didn't skip them. I think you were just trying to kind of give a brief mention in the moment there.
Yes, I actually thought about including everything, but was worried about time, which obviously has not. So yeah, so Ames National Laboratory, which is a part of the CMI, has, you know, over a dozen researchers doing critical materials work. Argonne National Lab has a huge team, a lot of folks doing supply chain decision science, looking at a lot of battery work. They have the Resell Center there for advanced battery recycling. Brookhaven National Lab has a handful of researchers looking at lithium batteries and kind of cobalt and the role of cobalt in cathodes and batteries. Idaho National Lab, who's a member of the CMI, they have a lot of work going on in the kind of biogeochemical impacts of critical materials, waste, biorecovery of different critical materials from mining wastes, electrochemical recovery, enhanced separation of critical materials, recycling, e-waste, looking back at kind of fundamental solution theory to improve chemical separations. There's some kind of supply chain market dynamic research going on there, technology development road mapping. So there's quite a bit of work going on at INL. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has extraction of rare earths and lithium from geothermal brines, and then also some novel technology for battery electrode recycling. Lawrence Livermore National Lab has a lot of computational work going on, some alloy development for advanced manufacturing, systems biology enabled design for rare earth binding ligands and rare earth recovery. There's a lot of work going on in the kind of reduction in critical mineral usage in magnets and other materials using computational thermodynamics, machine learning, that sort of thing. There's some bio-based extraction of rare earths. And then looking at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, they have some work going on in the circular economy space, some separation science, battery material synthesis, and looking at renewable graphite for lithium ion batteries. I accidentally skipped over Los Alamos National Labs. They have several folks looking at mining and extraction of lanthanides from ore, looking at uranium, and looking at ways to develop new alloys and metallic materials. They also have folks looking at laser-based analysis of rare earths in coal-based materials. Oak Ridge National Lab, again, a member of the CMI, a lot of separation science, looking at kind of more deeply into first principles for magnets and thermoelectrics and superconductors, adsorption and separations using a variety of approaches. Let's see here. Some kind of bio-inspired techniques to look at anion recognition. Robotic disassembly for spent electric vehicle packs for recycling. Pacific Northwest National Lab has several researchers who are doing lanthanide extraction from seawater using sea algae. So very cool technology there. And then looking at kind of functional properties to reduce demand for platinum group metals. And then finally, Sandia National Lab has several folks who are looking at rare earth metals from coal ash, as well as some kind of biologically inspired extraction of rare earths.
Great, thank you so much. And I know there's a lot more work going on at the national labs. I think in the interest of time, we can't go through all of them. Then another question that came in, and I think everyone should kind of keep in mind that I think we kind of focused a little bit more on the DOE side of things, since that's kind of where the funding for this project came from. But could you comment on the role of Department of Interior / US Geological Surveys programming in the context of DOE, DOD, and EPA programming that you mentioned? This person's kind of thinking specifically about the Earth MRI program and related efforts to assess available critical minerals reserves.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know in the infrastructure bill that there's a big appropriation, in plans to allocate to USGS for more of kind of the mineral mapping, surveying, that sort of thing. I myself have not tracked the USGS and the DOI appropriations recently. I do know that USGS has entered into a partnership with DARPA. There's a current competition going on to develop AI and machine learning tools to more quickly assess some of those resources. And so that competition is available now. I believe it's August 15th through sometime in October. That's all that I have at the moment, though.
Great, thank you. And I should mention that originally we had actually planned to have a webinar with USGS this week as well. However, with the IRA coming out, things got very hectic very quickly. So we decided to postpone that, but please keep an eye out for that to be announced in the coming months. And then another question or comment that came in was that you mentioned that the laboratories have the ability to conduct research with industry under proprietary agreements. When a company with whom this person collaborated with asked to work under the CMI, the program apparently directed the company to work with universities instead. Can you kind of discuss more about some of one-on-one project research opportunities, either with CMI or other national labs?
Yeah, so I know that at least from my conversations with the CMI, and hopefully I'm not misrepresenting them here, but there are several levels of participation. So there are kind of, being a team member, and I believe that's one big group that all agrees to the same contractual agreement, that there are not specific NDAs for each member, but that it's one master non-disclosure agreement and an IP management plan. But there are other levels of participation available. So there are affiliate members, which there's a membership fee for that. And rather than kind of co-owning IP and driving the R&D, the affiliates, get to know CMI, they get first public notice of IP available for licensing. And then there's the sponsored research partner. That's where some of the kind of the CRADA type contract comes in, performing kind of sponsored research, corporate sponsored research with the CMI team members. As far as, being that specific situation, I can't really comment on just because I'm not a CMI member and obviously don't know that specific situation, but thought I could cover kind of the different membership modes for them.
Perfect. Thank you. And then could you kind of clarify how your analysis focused on early stage R&D opportunities as opposed to later stage pilot and deployment efforts?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
Okay. We'll move on to the next one then. Are there any tie-ins to kind of the hydrogen hubs or the distribution of transmission of hydrogen that you know of? I think it's a little bit off topic from the report, but worth asking.
Not that I know of. I'm sure there are folks at the national labs who are doing work in the hydrogen space, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are some similar folks to critical materials folks, but I'm not sure.
Okay. And then do you know if CMM research was the topic of any of the X-Lab meetings back in 2019, 2020?
I'm not sure.
Okay. And then looks like that is kind of the last of the questions that have come in so far. We'll give everyone another 30 seconds or so if they want to type in any others. Just as a reminder, links to the recording as well as to the slides from the presentation will be posted to our event page, as well as the report itself. Please give us a couple of days to do this. We'll try and get everything up by tomorrow and notify everyone once that has been completed. I will post the link to the event page in the chat for everyone, just in case you want to take a look. And then it looks like there's a comment from Tom Lagrasso at Ames Lab that was directed towards Stephen and your particular situation. So thank you for that. And with that, I don't think anyone has ever complained about a webinar ending 20 minutes early. So I'm gonna give everyone a little bit of time in their busy schedules back. Morgan, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Really appreciate it. Really excited to get this out to the public. I think it's going to be pretty useful. It's great information, and I think there's kind of a lot of opportunities coming through the IRA as well as the BIL, and a lot of questions coming out as well. So I think this is super useful. So thank you again. And with that, I hope everyone has a good rest of the week and have a good upcoming weekend. We will see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.